One of the most insightful observations about the notion of politics was made by Lindblom in the late 1950s, who argued that the essence of politics is to secure scarce resources, including those associated with exercising power and authority, securing adequate staff, and controlling finances and budgets to support your group's values. Wirt and Kirst also observed that the policy-making process is becoming increasingly politicized due to how state and local governments relate to their school system. New definitions of the purpose of schooling, multiple claims on resources, demands that schools be responsive to interest groups and support their values, have heightened politics surrounding education. In addition, scholars view organizations, including schools, as miniature political systems, giving rise to concepts of micropolitics, in which staff, administrators, and parents strive to influence policy processes that determine how scarce resources are distributed. In retrospect, one of the greatest stumbling blocks to securing adequate financial support for education has been the notion that education and politics don't mix. This political myth was born about 100 years ago, still persists, and in large measure undermines the ability of educators to secure adequate resources for schools and districts. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, local control, decentralized ward-based school committee systems, and school board elections enabled politicians to gain control of decision-making processes and treated schools as part of the political spoil system. Municipal corruption was widespread, and it was not uncommon for principal positions and teacher and janitorial jobs, as well as school service contracts, to be regarded as political favors. At the turn of the 20th century, about 1900, progressive reformers, including university presidents, superintendents, business and professional elites, led a movement to free public schools from partisan politics and create the best system of education to serve the common good. The watchwords for reform became centralization, expertise, professionalism, non-political control, and efficiency. As a consequence, school boards became smaller, elections were conducted at large and in off-election years to free them from political party influence. In addition, administration was centralized under the superintendent, which effectively cut through the inefficient maze of school board subcommittee control. Although some historians believe that this progressive movement in public education reflected broader efforts by community-oriented citizens to curb the influence of corrupt politicians, others viewed it as an attempt by WASP elites to curb growing power of lower and lower middle-class citizens, many of whom were recent immigrants. In theory, educators benefited by having schools viewed as a unique function in society. They received adequate funding in exchange for staying out of politics, gained higher social status, salaries, and professional control. In practice, however, when state-level finances became tight, educators who were not politically skilled fared less well than others. Although progressives put public schools on a steady state 100 years ago, reforms launched during the last 3 decades highlight the political nature of education. Wirt and Kirst suggest that this reflects a continuing tension between the community's need for good schools and leadership and their desire to have their political will carried out. To complicate the issue of who controls education, the demographic characteristics of communities, political values, and concepts of how schools should be governed has changed, in some instances rather dramatically. Political tensions that are adding to the turbulence in public education emerge from a wide array of contested issues, including parent control, taxpayer and financial reform, racial minorities and desegregation, students and their rights, state and federal authority, political forces outside the locality, including political partisans, interest groups, Supreme Court decisions, and new ideas about learning and teaching. One way to look at the nature of politics in education is through the notion of political ecosystems. Systems thinking, ecosystem models, and force field analysis techniques not only provide frameworks for analyzing complex external environments in which organizations are embedded, but also provide tools needed by leaders to identify political interest groups, manage relationships among allies and enemies, as well as negotiate compacts, accords, and alliances. In sum, the notion of an ecosystem reflects a real set of relationships among forces present in the environment. Let's look at several ecosystem levels. First, let's talk about society as an ecosystem. The dynamic relationship among multinational corporations, governments, and societal interests have created a turbulent and high-stakes education environment. With regard to public policy ecosystems, everyone believes that good schools are important in that they enable children to acquire knowledge and skills needed for their future success, but also help build human capital essential for national well-being. Everyone has a stake in public schools: businesses, teachers, taxpayers, the state and federal governments, but there is no agreement on how to achieve them. Some advocate continuation of the common school, while others support the use of vouchers, charter schools, and choice. Consequently, a wide array of interest groups press to have their values supported in the public policy arena. In sum, our collective future will be negotiated on a political platform. This requires that education leaders have an acuity to play in this arena. We know that organizations are political arenas. All organizational processes are political in that they define the rules, who may play, what is contested, and what may be gained in terms of scarce resources. Organizational and political theorists have different views. On the one hand, conventional organizational theorists believe that an organization's structure should be designed to contribute to efficient attainment of organizational goals. On the other hand, political theorists believe that organizations are designed to maximize preferences and interests of those who have power and control of organizations. In other words, political theorists believe that those who have power in organizations want to keep it and act accordingly. Those who don't have power want to get it. Hence, decisions on the distribution of power and resources are continually contested. Let's look briefly at politics and decision-making. As long as enduring differences, scarce resources, and interdependence are present in organizations, politics will exist and political pressures will distort decisions. Here are some definitions that may prove useful in understanding politics and decision-making. Enduring differences. When people interpret events differently, they find it difficult to agree on what is true and what is important. Scarce resources. You can't have everything that you want. Thus, decisions about who gets what, when, and how must be continuously made and often revisited. Interdependence. To get what you want, you need to gain the assistance of others. That means you have to form coalitions to advance your own interests as well as those of your organization. In sum, highly effective leaders need to have the political acuity to survive and prosper. The political frame draws on the field of political science and views organizations as arenas in which different interest groups compete for power and scarce resources. Politics is about the distribution of resources, who gets what, when, and how. They view conflict as a normative part of organizational life because individuals and groups have different needs, perspectives, and values. Coalitions form around specific interests, and bargaining, negotiation, coercion, and compromise are part of everyday organizational life. Many problems arise because power is either concentrated in the wrong places in an organization, or it is so dispersed that nothing gets done. They persuasively argue that leaders need to have political acumen and skill to advance the interests of the organization. To use the familiar phrase, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Bowman and Deal effectively lay out the assumptions of the political frame. First, organizations are coalitions composed of various individuals and interest groups. Second, there are enduring differences among individuals and groups with respect to their values, preferences, beliefs, information, and perceptions of reality that change slowly, if at all. Third, Most of the important decisions in organizations involve the allocation of resources, who gets what, when, and how. Fourth, because of scarce resources and enduring differences, conflict is central to organizational dynamics, and power is the most important resource. Fifth, organizational goals and decisions emerge from bargaining and negotiations among key players in organizational coalitions. I'd like to note that coalitions are central to developing a power base, and the notion that you can get more by acting as a group than as an individual is an important concept. The terms of macro and micro politics refer to different levels of political activity. We know that in general, the term politics refers to decisions about the allocation of goods in society or an organization. Again, who gets what, when, and how. The terms macro and micro politics refer to two broad dimensions of the politics of education. They involve conflictual as well as cooperative processes, including the pursuit of individual and group interests, the exercise of power and influence, engaging in strategic interaction, and understanding how values and ideologies may influence decisions and alliances. Macropolitics refers to the relationship between an organization and its external environment. An example of this in education is the school district's involvement with local, state, and federal government education agencies, as well as interactions with private organizations such as foundations, social service and health agencies, as well as institutions of higher education. Scholars concur that interaction among these organizations and agencies may influence politics surrounding national, state, and local educational reform, as well as to adoption and implementation processes. Micropolitics, on the other hand, is associated with activities within the organization. Beginning in the early 1990s, policy studies in education focused on reform implementation processes. For example, Boyd observes that the most influential policymakers are those who actually implement legislation and are often referred to as street-level bureaucrats. These individuals may reshape or even resist the intentions of policies promulgated by school boards, state boards of education, state legislatures, and Congress. Thus, the study of micropolitics in schools and districts is a way to understand why there is a difference between what is intended by policies and the reality of implementation. Mawhinney refers to this as the implementation gap of education reform. In addition, Blaze and Blaze have persuasively argued that micropolitics is a critical aspect of many organizational structures and processes, and often constitutes the central mechanism through which major organizational outcomes related to school change and reform are produced. They argue that an organization's political processes involve both formal and informal dimensions of its political culture. In this regard, political culture may influence school outcomes, including student-teacher relations, teaching practices, test scores, decision-making processes, and other events. The degree to which political processes and political culture account for a given outcome may vary from one school to another, and over time may vary within the same school. The notion of the influence of micropolitics on educational reform is key to understanding why things change and others remain the same. Micropolitical processes and structures reflect a school or district office's political culture and account for both stability and change in school settings. To many scholars, it's evident that some political forces may work to maintain the status quo, while others serve the interests of change and reform. In most instances, externally imposed education reform initiatives must contend with existing internal political cultures that either protect the school's status quo or advance change. Blaze notes that during periods of externally imposed educational reform, change dynamics including ambiguity, uncertainty, and conflict tend to increase the level and the intensity of political interaction within the school or district office. As the intensity of political interaction increases and new micropolitical processes and structures emerge, they become more visible. A key concept of the political frame is conflict. However, it's viewed differently by theorists in the structural, human relations, and political frames. For example, in the structural frame, organizations are guided by goals and policies set at the top by managers and emphasize social control and norms of rationality. Conflict is viewed as a problem and that interferes with the accomplishment of organizational purposes. A hierarchy of authority is employed to resolve conflict, and bosses tend to say, if there's a problem here, you're it. In the human resource frame, conflict is a mismatch between the needs of people and the organization, and considerable importance is placed on leaders managing interpersonal and group dynamics. Thus, conflict in the human resource frame is viewed as an organizational illness that must be healed. The political frame is quite different. It views conflict as a natural and inevitable condition that emerges from differences among individuals and group interests. The political frame allows real issues to emerge and values the ability to confront conflict directly. Conflict is not viewed as a problem or a sign that something's wrong. Political theorists argue that suppressing real issues will cause them to appear in other forms and make them more difficult to identify and thus more difficult to resolve. In sum, conflict is inevitable, so we have to learn how to work with it. Scholars provide insight into the importance of conflict in the political frame. For example, they believe that conflict will usually emerge under conditions of scarcity and appear at the boundaries between different groups, horizontally between departments, vertically between levels of an organization, and culturally between different groups that have distinct values, beliefs, and lifestyles. They also note that the focus of the political frame is not on resolving conflict, but on developing strategies and tactics needed to manage it. In addition, they believe that conflict serves as a vehicle for changing the status quo. It heightens interest levels, stimulates creativity and innovation, and is the basis of personal, social, and organizational change. However, they also agree that too much or too little conflict is viewed as problematic. Political theorists agree that the level of scarcity and how resources are distributed will create different levels of conflict and predict when politics will be visible in organizations. In this sense, competition for scarce resources will stimulate the formation of coalitions. They form because, 1, interdependence among members is useful. In other words, you get more by working together than alone. 2, politics will be more visible under conditions of diversity than homogeneity. In other words, shared values and beliefs reduce conflict. 3, politics will be more visible when resources are scarce. And 4th, every job has a power gap that must be filled by leaders to maintain their positions. If you don't, you just go home. The main point I want to make today is that politics and effective leadership are inseparable. The political frame asserts that interdependence, enduring differences, and power relations will produce political forces. You can't eliminate politics, but you can learn to understand and manage political processes. As Mick Jagger said, you can't always get what you want, and if you try, sometimes you might just get what you need. What I'd like you to do now is review key concepts and briefly discuss the notion of the apolitical myth and reflect on its impact on education during the last several decades. Then, I'd like you to apply what you've learned. Use the notion of scarce resources in conflict to analyze events in your organization and examine how leaders have responded. Use the assumptions of the political frame to discuss how you would provide leadership in your organization under conditions of resource scarcity. I hope this brief overview of the political frame will prove helpful.